So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's online and in-person program titled The Man Beneath the Paint, California Impressionist Tilden Daken. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. For those of you that might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the history and the literature of California and the West, like we're doing tonight. The book club publishes limited edition finely made books, a scholarly journal called the Quarterly Newsletter, and keepsakes for our members. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member of the book club, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest and our benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without the support of our members. So I encourage you, if you're here in the club rooms, to speak to myself or one of the staff after the program, or you can just check us out online at bccbooks.org. Now, tonight's program. The program is titled, as I said, The Man Beneath the Paint, California Impressionist Tilden Daken. Our speaker is Bonnie Portnoy. Bonnie Portnoy is an author and historian who lives in the North Bay. She lives just a few miles north of the Mill Valley Arts and Crafts House that was built by her grandfather, Tilden Daken, in the 1920s. Prior to embarking on the legacy project for Tilden Daken, she spent 3 decades in senior management positions in merchandising, marketing, and operations for Joseph Magnin, World Market, Gumps, and Just Desserts. Maybe my favorite.
Put 10 pounds on it.
Her biography of her grandfather, which was published in 2024, is The Man Beneath the Paint. In it, she reveals the mysteries of an artist whose life was as colorful as his paintings. It's a life filled with daring adventure, personal tumult, and a relentless pursuit of artistic expression. Now, Bonnie's going to share much, much more about the subject of tonight's talk, but I'm just going to give you a little snippet, a little background for those of you who might not know. California Impressionist Tilden Daken, famous in his day, painted in every single California state park and national park in the West, from the redwood forests to the high Sierra, and beneath the Pacific Ocean in a custom-built diving bell. He was one of the most prolific and adventurous painters in the American West. A fresco painter early in his career, he is primarily known as the painter of the Valley of the Moon, painter of the Redwoods, and the Key of Red Painter. Such a little different format there. The Key of Red Painter, among many others. A close friend of writer Jack London, Daken lost his home and studio in San Francisco's 1906 earthquake, got caught up in the Mexican Revolution, and participated in the 1915 Panama-Pacific International Exposition. And tonight, Bonnie Portnoy shares the fascinating life, exciting exploits, and the lasting legacy of Tilden Daken. Now, if you have questions, please wait till the end of the talk, end of the presentation. We will certainly have time for some questions. We also have the book here available for those of you who are interested in looking at the book or acquiring the book for your library. And we're going to take questions from you here in the club rooms and from you folks out there on Zoom. And you can use the chat and the Q&A functions on Zoom, and we'll curate questions from that audience there, again, at the end of the presentation. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Bonnie Portnoy.
Good evening, and thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the Book Club of California Founded in 1912, which very much was my grandfather's era in San Francisco. So I like to tie that together, and thank you to all of you today for coming this evening and out there in Zoom land. Welcome. Well, Kevin, I don't know if I have to even speak. You covered pretty much the whole talk. Those of you out there watching on Zoom, my head's going to be going back and forth to the screen a lot, so don't pay attention to me. Look at my slides. But yes, my grandfather, the grandfather I never knew, my maternal grandfather. I don't write in the book use the words rogue or womanizer, but yeah, I dug up a lot of dirt on him. He died during the Depression, so I didn't know him. I didn't even know where he was buried when I started this project. It all began in my childhood. My mother would share stories of the friendship he had with Jack London, and we have still today a beautiful family scrapbook full of his. He was a handsome man. Wonderful black and white photographs on black paper with white ink captions. And I became very enraptured with my grandfather just from my mother's stories. She had only two paintings of his, a beautiful redwoods painting and a small lake scene. And between the photographs, the stories she would share, and the paintings, I used to wonder who was the man beneath the paint, hence the title of the book. And of course, then the genesis of this whole project was my mother, Edith Daken. She was born in Glen Ellen, Jack London's town, in 1907. Her sister was born the following year, Sydney, my Aunt Sydney. My mother adored her father, but he wasn't in her life much. He was a wanderer, painting in the wilds for months at a time. She called him a dreamer. She'd say he used to travel to faraway places. Her family was poor because every painting that my grandfather sold went back into his far-flung expeditions, not to the family. She was 11 when my grandparents had a very bitter divorce in San Francisco, which you will hear about, and 28 when her father died. So he was a mystery man. But years went on, decades. My curiosity, but I raised a family, and as you heard, I was in pretty busy traveling the world in my career, and never took the time to research my grandfather until my mother, here in this slide, turned 92, and I thought, it's time to spend an hour in the library and bring her a morsel about her father, and then get on with the rest of my life. And that was more than 2 decades ago. She used to say, you know, my father was famous and you should write a book about him. And of course I would roll my eyes, right, Mom? Well, in 1999, on a very stormy day, I was planning to head to San Francisco Library across the Golden Gate Bridge, and the storms for weeks and torrential downpours and high winds, they were threatening to close the Golden Gate Bridge. I altered my plans. I couldn't procrastinate any longer and headed to the Civic Center in San Rafael, beautiful Frank Lloyd Wright building, to do some research in that library, wondering if it was even open. That's what kind of a stormy day it was. And in the art history aisle, there was only one other woman in the library. And we began reaching for the same and similar books in the art history aisle. The woman turned to me and asked me what I was researching. I said, my grandfather, he was an early California artist. She asked me his name. I told her, and she said, I am researching your grandfather. I think if that had not happened, I'm not sure I'd be standing here today. Is Barbara Leckish. She had published Tahoe place names in the 90s and was researching for a book she published in 2003, Embracing Scenes about Lake Tahoe and Donner Lake. and was researching my grandfather for the piece about him in that book. And she set me on a journey. She had all kinds of questions about him that I couldn't answer because I knew nothing about him. But she said he's listed in the Smithsonian and gave me direction about how to find the art that was there and set me on the path. And I thought, this is pretty kismet. I think I better continue on with this journey. And I did. And my mother was right. My grandfather in his day was very famous, not a whole household name today, but I found literally hundreds and hundreds of newspaper articles, initially in California libraries here in Sacramento, LA. But over time, of course, the newspapers have become digitized, and I was able to find articles all over the United States, in Canada. He was in a British magazine, Sunset magazine. And so as much of it was family lore, but also stories in the newspaper and letters that I found. His legacy. The historians say he painted as many as 4,000 works in oil. His works, some of them are held in about 8 museums. He's mentioned in nearly 24 books. This is the first full biography, my book. He published his own short stories. I have found 2 about his wild and crazy adventures. He spoke before audiences. He was no shrinking violet when it came to the press. They loved him and he loved them. He exhibited coast to coast, and there have been exhibitions since his death. And what makes him, I think, so endearing to me is the stories about the people he knew, noted people in not only the Bay Area, but Southern California when he moved to Hollywood. Dozens of noted personalities that are mentioned in the book, other writers, other artists, movie stars, politicians, and he loved to hobnob and seek out the famous. But what I learned pretty quickly is that he was one of the most adventurous artists in the American West. And you can just look at these photographs and see sort of, he had one of the collectors calls it the Tilden Daken wardrobe style about him, of the white artist shirts and the breeches and the knee boots laced to the knee. But he was never without his sketch box because he was always heading off to the backwoods to paint, and his tubes of paint and his canvas and small art boards were in that sketch box. He was so adventuresome that many people who have read the book or heard my talk say, this is movie material. I could never tell a prospective publisher that. You're not supposed to say that. But one of the collectors sent this to me last year and said, Bonnie, there's only one man who put this collage together. One man who can play your grandfather, and that is Ryan Gosling. So I thought I'd share that. Last year, there were 2 exhibitions just around the time the book was launched. One at the Sonoma Museum of Sonoma County. It was a 4-month show called The Art of Adventure. And the show then traveled on to the Jack London State Park, The Art of Adventure. And I felt such gratitude looking at my grandfather's paintings hanging there, juxtaposed to the giant digital photographs of his buddy, Jack London. And so, yes, Mother, I did write the book, The Man Beneath the Paint. I'm very proud of it. It is a beautiful book. The end papers are Tahoe paintings of his, front and back. And the back of the book is a testimonial by Armando Quintero, who is the director of our California State Parks. He's been to my talks. He's been to the museum to see the works. He himself is an artist and he lives in Marin County. He wrote a beautiful piece about my grandfather. I'm not going to take the time to read it because I do tend to run over time. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to kind of go through the slides pretty quickly. But he mentioned how Tilden lived in a golden age of artists, writers, and scientists, and championed the promotion of landscapes that are today pretty precious. There's also a piece in there from a noted art historian, Nancy Dustin Walmore. Bonnie Portnoy did not hesitate to reveal family secrets. I won't say anything more about her writing, but I'll share a few family secrets. And Matt Leffert, the director of the Jack London State Park, wrote a beautiful foreword in which he mentions the friendship with Jack London. So Impressionism is the art of painting en plein air, which means in the open. Most artists that painted in plein air, including my grandfather, didn't finish every detail of the painting out there in the open necessarily. They would finish it in their studio, which my grandfather often would, so 3 in the morning painting. Impressionism, as most of you know, began in France in the early 1800s, made it to America by the middle of the 1800s, but it was the transcontinental train, which was built and finished in 1869, I think, that brought artists from Europe and from the eastern United States to the beauty of California. And there were 2 generations of Impressionists. The first generation was called early California artists, and they were painting around the 1860s to the 1890s. The second generation is the Tilden Daken group, the California Impressionists, which were active from about 1900 to the Great Depression. And even within that era, in the 20s, certainly modern art was tapping at those painters' back heels. And there's many quotes in the book from my grandfather through letters he wrote and from interviews, but he very clearly made it clear that he hated modern art. It was never going to survive. It was very ugly, and people love nature. They want to see nature because obviously he loved nature. But he was prolific with the redwoods, the county scenes, Sonoma, Marin County, Southern California, the High Sierra National Park, state parks. He painted in Alaska, parts of the East Coast, Mexico, Hawaii, and the South Seas. He got around. He was born Samuel Tilden Daken, and he was named after Samuel Tilden, the charismatic governor of New York, who was running for president the year my grandfather was born, 1876. So my great-grandparents obviously were going to vote for Samuel Tilden, the Democrat, who ended up losing to Rutherford Hayes in a very hotly contested backroom deal in January in Congress win. He was born in Bunker Hill, Illinois, and his surname was Daken with an E, and by the time he was about 40 years old, he had dropped the name Samuel and gone just by Tilden Daken. I think Tilden being maybe a little more an artsy name, and for reasons we don't quite know, changed the spelling of his surname to Daken with an I. So the research on my part with all those versions of his name was a challenge, but his signature style evolved over time and allowed me to be able to identify the era in which he painted based on his signature. In 1879, when he was 3 years old, the family left Illinois and arrived in Sacramento. And I say family of 7 to give you an idea of how little my mother knew about the family. She believed he was an only child her entire life till I discovered this. And he was actually the youngest of 5 children, and they all outlived him. And she never met his parents, and they lived near her the entire time. He was unschooled, which wasn't unusual for the time, but he was extremely athletic. He loved hiking. He would head to the backwoods even as a child. He was a strong swimmer. He was 6 feet tall and very athletic. And he lived in Sacramento at a time when the passenger steamships were navigating that waterway, and he would swim after the passenger ships, and the passengers would throw pennies overboard to him, which he would dive for and bring to the shore. So I mentioned how strong a swimmer he was because, we had to the diving bell story. At age 6, he began painting and studied classical music. And by his teens, he was in San Francisco painting frescoes in limestone in mansions and theater curtains. That's one of his earliest paintings, Sacramento, California, American River. I like to say that his life was bookended in the gold rush. His father, when they lived in Sacramento, took him on many journeys into the gold country, which was on the way to Tahoe, El Dorado County, Placer County. And I think that's part of how he was instilled with at a very young age, with an impression of adventure. And he returned to the mines in the 1890s when he was a teenager. He had by this time been painting in San Francisco, but during the recession, which was called the Panic of 1893, he returned to the mines to make some money, to earn some money for art lessons, etc., and couldn't sell paintings in the recession period. Excuse me. And years later, the Chronicle wrote, "There's a lot of wanderlust in Daken. He went as a mucker," that's underground mining, "into the mines of El Dorado County and worked at some of the hardest labor ever devised by man. Yet each night he painted in the tent by the light of a gas lantern." So art was always very much on his mind. 1903, San Francisco, my grandparents married. My grandmother, Mary May, she was called Elizabeth Duplessis. She was born 2 years after in San Francisco. She was born in San Francisco 2 years after Tilden. My grandmother died when I was 12. She lived in Southern California and I in Northern California, so I didn't know her well. She was a toughie. She never smiled. And we were not allowed to ask her anything about my grandfather. I know now through the bitter divorce why. She was French-Canadian ancestry. She was a dressmaker for high society, which allowed her to make some money for the family when my grandfather was gone. She taught Tilden how to read and write. Remember, he was unschooled, and that's important because he became a letter writer, thankfully, for me to find letters in libraries. They lived on Octavia Street, not far from San Francisco City Hall. And as you heard, Tilden opened a studio on Van Ness Avenue. But you know what happened in 1906? And it's the basis for chapter 4 in my book, The Day the Earth Shook. And I knew a lot of the stories from my mother about his experience, my grandparents' experience in the earthquake. But I am also very blessed to have family photographs of the 1906 earthquake because my grandmother's father, George Duplessis, was the man behind the camera. This is San Francisco, the Call building on Market Street in flames. And here is my grandfather, my grandmother on the right, and in the center is my great-grandmother, who I like to say sort of looks like a British dowager. They're standing on Market Street at 6th with the Hales department store in the background. And this is probably the most historic. There they are, the three of them standing in front of the burned out shell of San Francisco City Hall, which then was on Larkin near Grove Street. This is a great postcard I found online that depicts the Van Ness Avenue before the earthquake. It was a beautiful avenue. It wasn't car dealerships back then.
Yeah.
And the story that many of you know, and my grandparents marched off to the studio on Van Ness Avenue to collect his art supplies and his paintings, and were met with the Presidio men with the bayonets. Many people on Van Ness Avenue, including mansions, owners of mansions, lost their home when the city officials dynamited the whole corridor of Van Ness Avenue to stop the oncoming fires from destroying the western side of the city. It worked. but anyone who owned anything on Van Ness Avenue lost everything in the fire that perhaps had survived the earthquake. So my family and 200,000 other refugees moved to tent cities all throughout the city, and my family was in tent city in Golden Gate Park. And my mother bragged her entire life that she was conceived in tent city. And she was. This is the earliest known painting because he lost everything in his studio, 1906. I like to say, I wonder, perhaps that cow knows, was that before or after the earthquake that was painted, but it's Mount Tamalpais in the background. He did inscribe the back, verso inscribed. They moved to Glen Ellen, Sonoma County, 1,600 square miles of beauty. Many artists in San Francisco after the earthquake moved to Berkeley, to Carmel, to Monterey, to Southern California. I'm not sure why my grandfather chose Glen Ellen, but perhaps there's a hint coming. They moved to the Mineral Springs and Health Resort, which was billed as the most picturesque pleasure and health resort in California. It was 30 cottages. They all were named. They lived in the Laura Lee cottage. And across the creek lived Jack London and Charmian. Jack had left his first wife and 2 daughters in Oakland and married Charmian, and they moved to Glen Ellen in 1905, and they lived in the Wake Robin Lodge, which was her aunt's home at the time, and began then developing Beauty Ranch while my grandfather was there, and is today, of course, the Jack London State Park. If you haven't been to the park, put it on your bucket list. It's gorgeous. So there's the happy couples. Well, the happy couple on the right is Jack and Charmian London at their cottage at Beauty Ranch circa 1911. The not so happy looking couple on the left is my grandparents, a photograph that is stamped on the back, Glen Ellen, by the photographer, and stamped with the date 1907. But the family stories, and you see my grandmother did never smile. The stories are that Tilden and Jack hung out in many of the lively bars. There were 8 bars and inns in Glen Ellen back in the day. And much to the chagrin of Charmian, because Jack London was not a healthy man. Most of you know he died at age 40, and he was a drinker. Not so much my grandfather, but he was along for the ride. So this was one of their hangouts, which today is called the Jack London Saloon. It was built in 1905, the Chauvet Saloon. And I took a photograph of this during the exhibition at the Jack London State Park with the banner there and the motorcycles, and my brother took it and did a Photoshop and took the motorcycles out and put Tilden and Jack there. So I love that. Obviously, journalists drew comparisons to Tilden Daken and Jack London in those years. The Chronicle wrote, "The charm and poetry of Jack London's Valley of the Moon has been perpetuated by Daken's brush, and Daken became known as the painter of the Valley of the Moon." They had there's many stories in the book about their friendship and the agreements they had that sort of ended up not coming to fruition, like the first edition of Valley of the Moon was to have in the frontispiece one of my grandfather's paintings of the Valley of the Moon, and that didn't happen. So lots of stories, side stories there. But they were 2 of a pair, and they were born the same year. So here's the Daken girls, my mother and my aunt, Edna and Sydney, born in 07 and 08. And I might mention that there's not one photograph in the scrapbook that has the family posing together, which could be telling. But because my grandmother was a dressmaker, they were always dressed in the prettiest handmade dresses, and they did look like twins and were mistaken for twins over the years. What my mother didn't know, and she lived, remember she was 92 when I started this research, she lived to 97. She was sharp as a tack. She loved all the stories I would bring her, but I didn't discover until after she was gone. Many things I discovered after she was gone, but I discovered that Jack and Tilden first met not in Glen Ellen in 1906 after the earthquake, but in 1901 atop a haystack in the Reno train station. And most of you know that Jack London was a hobo in his early days, traveling all over the Western United States and Canada, and then writing about the men of the rails that he met along the way. My grandfather was not, but he was arriving in Reno from Salt Lake City. I'm not sure where Jack was arriving from, and my grandfather climbed up a ladder into a hay loft, and there was Jack with his notebook, and they became fast friends. So that is the basis for chapter 2 in my book, because 20 years after they met, in 2021, Tilden was interviewed by the San Francisco Call-and-Post in essentially a 20th anniversary of their friendship, though Jack had died 5 years earlier. And it's a charming article. Therefore, most of it is in Tilden's words about their meeting in the haystack. And the train was not coming till the next morning. He loaned Jack some money so Jack could go out and buy snails and donuts. And Jack taught my grandfather the rules of his role. Like Jack and my grandfather for this road, they rode the brake beams inches above the track. And my grandfather said Jack carried a padded board for the purpose. My grandfather didn't have a padded board, but they got on the train. They got off in Truckee and worked in a lumber yard together, got somehow back on, climbed on the brake beams, got kicked off the train over Donner Pass.
Oh my.
Somehow got back on, eventually made their way to Oakland and shook hands. Whether they ever saw one another again between then and Glen Ellen, I don't know, but they were kindred spirits, both extreme adventurers. The story in that chapter finishes in my grandfather's words with, London had a big heart, too big of a heart for his own good. And our notes, I worked mine into several canvases, and you'll find Jack's developed in some of the stories of those days. So my grandparents were in Sonoma County for 6 years totally, 3 in Glen Ellen and 3 in Santa Rosa, and he painted with gusto many, many Sonoma County works. And he was, as my mother said, a dreamer and also a lousy finance guy. He had many dreams that were big dreams that failed. And somehow he would always land back on his feet. This was the first that I learned of that he spent 4 years fundraising and planning the Daken Art Institute that was to be in Santa Rosa and associated with the American Art Association in New York. And it failed, and he went into huge debt. His works were his early works. If you see, you'll see a transition in his art. William Keith, many of you might know him as a famous early California artist. He was 38 years older than my grandfather, but they painted together, they exhibited together, and he considered him his mentor. William Keith died in 1911. But my grandfather's early style was very William Keith-like. Tonalism is more earthy, similar color tones, and less impressionistic. Over time, he became more impressionistic. This is like 8 feet long. I haven't seen this in person. It hangs at a home in San Diego, but it's inscribed on the back hang in Sonoma County. Oops. This was painted, this is famous Bell Ranch after showers near Glen Ellen, 1907. So it was painted right around the time my mother was born in Glen Ellen, and famous Bell Ranch has quite a story that the story is in the book about Mary Ellen Pleasant, who came from the South as a slave. And it's a wonderful story. And it was painted in her ranch. Big Sulphur Creek, Sonoma Geysers. That is a massive painting, that one. On the road to Glen Ellen, I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. The iconic mountain in Sonoma County is Sonoma Mountain or Mount Sonoma. And of these 4 paintings, 2 are in the Oakland Museum and 2 in the Sonoma Museum. Again, you can see how his style evolved and color over time. This is Valley of the Moon, Mount Sonoma in the distance, circa 1920. So he was always returning to Sonoma County to paint. This is indicative of some of his almost red paintings. This once hung in the Fresno Metropolitan Museum near Santa Rosa. And as Kevin said, a painter of the redwoods. He had a passion for painting the redwoods. Here he is in the Russian River circa 1911, completely absorbed with painting the redwoods of the Russian River. And like most artists, he was a conservationist and an activist, and was associated in some form with Save the Redwoods. There's several articles about his involvement, which I think was more bringing the beauty of the forests to the public at the time. Mr. Daken has joined the crusade to save the redwoods. They are threatened with extinction at the hands of the lumbermen. Mr. Daken, one of the few men to have successfully painted the giant forests, has done much with his pictures to create public sentiment on their behalf. And there's many, hundreds and hundreds, and he was quoted as saying he painted in every redwood grove in the state, and I believe it. This is Sonoma County, in Coleman Canyon near Occidental in Sonoma County. Near woods, he eventually, lived in Mill Valley, so he frequented near woods, Calaveras Grove. These are more near woods. This painting stands about as tall as I am, 5'8", and was titled View from Gurneywood Heights. It's of Armstrong Redwoods in Sonoma County. And he dated it 1909 to 1912, meaning he dabbled with it and changed it over time. The journalists called it the famous Russian River panel, and it's the most publicized painting of anything that I have discovered. Bantered about how much it cost, when it was sold. It was sold in the 1920s to a New York senator for $7,000, which was a lot of money at the time, and found its way back to San Francisco and hung in the Bohemian Club in the 1930s. Then went to auction, stayed in the same family for many decades until a local Bay Area collector bought it on eBay for less than $7,000. I won't tell you how much. And so, yes. The Dakens moved back to San Francisco in 1912, the year this organization was founded. And here is a painting he painted of the Golden Gate Strait before any bridges from atop Mount Tam. He didn't even detail any buildings in San Francisco, but you know what was going on in San Francisco. They were still pretty busy rebuilding the city. Somehow he fell on his feet and was able to get a studio, this one on Gough Street. This is a family photograph, so it's lost its luster, but look at the painting behind him. There it is. And I found this at the Bancroft Library, another angle of his studio. And again, you can see that tall painting there, and the size of many of his works varied greatly from small paintings to quite large paintings. Again, he became a letter writer, and it included some prominent men. Some of the Sonoma County years, Judge Leopold Giusti was a justice of the peace, insurance agent, winery guy. Charmian London was one of his clients. Lewis Hill was the chairman of the Great Northern Railway and was essentially very involved in developing Glacier National Park. I don't have time to go into those stories, but they were fascinating letters that are in the book. But the one that was the most eye-opening to me were the 7 letters he wrote to James D. Phelan over a period of 16 years, which allowed me to sort of follow his footsteps and learn what he was up to all those years. Phelan was the San Francisco mayor 2 terms at the beginning of the last century and became a US senator. But I think what most captured my grandfather was he was an art philanthropist and looking for recognition, looking for sometimes loans and involvement. The first three letters were written in 1912 to this poor politician who kept hearing from my grandfather. But letter number 4 captured my attention as it started. I'm getting ready to leave San Francisco for a couple of years. And he did. He moved to Mazatlan during the Mexican Revolution. My grandmother lived in San Francisco. My mother and aunt were 5 and 6 years old, and off he went for almost about a year and a half in Mazatlan. And because he was quoted as saying several times, I was a friend of Pancho Villa in his palmy days, which meant not the revolution probably, and I pretty much figured that out when he knew Pancho Villa. I won't go into it in this talk, but it's in the book. The family and historians believe that he went to Mexico for the Gringo cause, which lots of Bohemians crossed the border back then to support Pancho Villa. But he was shot, my grandfather, 3 times while he was there, and hauled into prison as a prisoner of war for a couple of months. Somehow either escaped or was let out and returned to San Francisco in late 1914 and wrote letter number 5 to James Phelan. And he said he did not mention that he'd been out of the country, only that he had to close his studio because he was taken ill. So he was obviously still licking his wounds when he returned. However, through much research, I discovered that he didn't go there for the Gringo cause, or at least that wasn't the main reason. His buddy, Andrew Blackiston, who was born the same year, was a very charismatic man. Maybe that's my next book, is Andrew Blackiston. He was a poet, a lawyer, a businessman, an archaeologist, and an anthropologist. All over South America, he was coming up with artifacts that are in the Smithsonian today. But important to the story, he was the owner of the Mexican National Development Company of Mazatlan, which was agricultural acres of strawberries and tomatoes, I believe. And together, they were working on bringing a Mexican exhibit to the 1915 Panama Exposition. And if I could go back in time, it would be this 1915 to visit what was arguably the most colorful World's Fair in our history. And of course, we know that the Palace of Fine Arts thankfully survived. It was a long show. It debuted in February and went through December. Here is my grandfather on the lagoon at the Palace of Fine Arts that's in the family scrapbook, 1915. And here's one of his Palace of Fine Arts paintings. You can see even in the distance that he detailed some of the fair buildings in addition to the Palace of Fine Arts. This is not a high resolution photograph, but I found it in Bonham's online. And he came back with dozens of sketches and paintings from his time in Mexico. And I found this one at circa 1914. And he wrote in verso, mountain scene in Mexico, west coast near Mazatlan. But in May of 1915, they weren't ready with the show that they had planned in Mexico. And these 2 characters sailed back to Mazatlan on the City Para ship. They left on May 28th and returned on June 9th, carrying 11 steamer trunks between them. And while they were down there, my grandfather, having been shot and in prison, went back to the war scene. And this is just a very rough sketch. He called it a sketch. He wrote on the back, sketch on the firing line, 1915, Mexico near Mazatlan. And you see the Mexicans loading cannonballs into the cannon and shooting to the opposition across the valley. So that tells you how crazy my grandfather was to go back to the war zone. But here's what they were up to. It debuted in late June or July of 1915 in the Palace of Agriculture at the 1915 PPIE. It was called the Mexican exhibit. Now, mind you, Mexico did not get permission because of everything that was going on in the revolution to show at the World's Fair. They attempted it. So this was the only Mexican show. It was a massive mural that my grandfather painted. He may have had, I'm sure, probably some apprentices, because they called, the journalists called it the vast red mural, but it was painted in the El Rosario region of Mazatlan. And it's the acres of crops that his buddy Andrew Blackiston owned. And the mural was 35 feet tall and 240 feet wide, and took 750 pounds of paint. And then all those little things that they pulled together, I'm sure some of those came back with them on the ship to depict agricultural theme. And here is a photograph. That was the San Francisco Public Library. I found another angle of this same exhibit in the Bancroft Library, and you can sort of get a better sense of the acreage reaching out towards the Sierra Madre. That summer, my grandparents took my daughter, my mother and my aunt on an outing to Land's End in San Francisco, and in the family scrapbook, and it's very enchanting photographs that leads to a story. I'll go through it quickly, but here's my grandmother and the girls, my grandfather and the girls playing in the sand. There's my grandfather in the background there. And on this day, joining them was my grandmother's cousin Edna, who was 17 years younger and the namesake of my mother. My mother was named Edna at birth. And there they are. Tilden is looking on at cousin Edna and my grandmother being on the right. And I have learned through this story, and my mother, I was 30 when my mother told me this story. I knew her as Edith, my mother. I introduced her at the beginning as Edith. When she was 8 years old, her mother said, Edna, you have to change your name. No explanation. You can keep the E, the blankets, the embroidery, the jewelry, the whatever that had E. So my mother chose Edith. It was the name of Teddy Roosevelt's wife and daughter, and it was a popular name. And in her teens, she overheard quite by accident of her father's affair. We knew this was coming, right? With cousin Edna. So he got out of Dodge and sailed to Hawaii. And here he is. These are not high resolution photos, these two, but Oahu, Diamond Head in the distance. Again, Diamond Head in the distance. He also that same year sailed to Kauai. This is Menehune Fish Pond, which is in the southern part of Hawaii and has in itself a wonderful history, which is in the book of the fish pond. And Limahuli Valley, some of you maybe have even visited there, which today is a national tropical garden in the northern part of Kauai. And that's Makana Mountain in the distance, which was the setting for the 1957 film, South Pacific. So that was Bali High for the film. Marine art. My grandfather first studied very early before the earthquake with Herman Dietz, who was a Russian sea painter who had come to San Francisco, left after the earthquake. Marine art is the, you know, if you think of the 18th, 19th century British paintings of ships at sea, it's the study of water. This was painted on the way to Alaska, Potlatch found in about 1917. But my grandfather took marine art to a very different direction beneath the sea. He was at Catalina Island. He went aboard one of the glass bottom boats, which you can still get on today, and became completely enraptured with the flora and fauna beneath the sea that they call submarine gardens. And remember that he was a strong swimmer in his youth. So he began to free dive to capture the flora and fauna, and would hold his breath for 3 or 4 minutes and cast a scene to memory and come to shore and paint it. until he had a few shark attacks and thought, there's got to be a better way to capture those underwater scenes. And when he was in Hawaii in 1915, he was painting at Pearl Harbor and observed Navy men experimenting with a diving bell. A submarine had sunk some months earlier and 25 Navy men had died, and they were experimenting with a diving bell. He came to the mainland, designed a diving bell and had it made. It was, and he called it the submarine studio. It was 1,500 pounds of metal, 5 feet tall by 5 feet wide. My grandfather stood 6 feet tall, so he sat on a little canvas stool and would peer out the portholes to paint. It was lowered by a barge with what I call 2 trustworthy men, because they were in charge of the cables and his air supply. And they would carry this thing up and down the coast of California and into Baja on a motor truck. And I found a painting, but he was said to have painted as many as 300 in the diving bell. There he is in Baja with his sketch box, and he exhibited some of these paintings across the country: LA, Chicago, New York. And the fish here are Garibaldi, our California state fish, which I did not know until the director of California State Parks came to a museum exhibit and said, "Bonnie, those are Garibaldi fish." Okay. And it was exhibited in Chicago in 1930. And from all of this, he wrote one of 2 short stories I have found called "In the Grip of an Octopus." And it was published all over the country in syndicated newspapers, full-page articles, and in Canada, and was in the Worldwide magazine, which was a men's adventure magazine in Britain, and Sunset magazine. And someone had hired other illustrators to depict the story. First, his story with freediving with sharks. There he is in his skivvies. And at one point, and it's a true story, he was wrapped in the arms of a giant Pacific octopus and almost died. Long story, it's in the book about how he lived, taking off his air tube and yelling up to his workers at POP. They had killed a lamb that morning to barbecue for dinner, and he said, "Throw the lamb, the bloody carcass, into the bay," and it distracted the octopus, and he let go of the diving bell. And my grandfather lived to tell the story and write the story. He wrote in his story, he wrote, "I have heard it said that the men confronted with sudden death review all the acts of their lives in a second. But I can assure you that just then I was extremely busy thinking not of what I had done, but what I was going to do to save my skin." And for those of you who really didn't believe it, my husband was one of them. He didn't have a diving bell. Well, here he is in the British magazine. After the incident with the giant Pacific octopus, you can see that it is slightly dented, and he built another one. Where he got the money to build another one, I have no idea. And his sketch box, you see, is right in front of him on a rock. And along the way, he would also, of course, paint some beautiful seascapes. This one in Ensenada, Baja, and another one in Ensenada at Punta Banda, which is near there. And then the divorce in 1918. Well, I never heard much about it from my mother, other than that I knew they divorced. But my grandmother, when they were separated before the divorce, had popped into his studio in San Francisco, and he was with clients in the front, and she slipped into the back, and there was his coat jacket, and she went through his pockets, which I'm sure she did her entire married life, and found 4 love letters that were addressed to "Dear Daddy" and signed "Your baby." And of course, she brought them to the judge in divorce court. And as you can see from the headlines, the Chronicle, the Examiner, the Call Bulletin, and we're talking 1918, it's the pandemic, Spanish flu, it's World War I going on, and yet they published the love letters in the city papers. And the judge said of Tilden, Tilden believes it's his right to follow the dictates of his own desires without ever being questioned by his wife or putting himself out to please her. And it was divulged in court to the shocked, I'm sure, judge that my grandfather was having an affair with Sophie Tucker, the vaudeville star, and that they lived briefly at 440 Hayes Street. And of all the things I've learned about my grandfather, somehow I can't see him with this woman, but that's the story. My mother was still alive when I found this article, and she loved it and laughed hysterically. And the Petaluma paper wrote after the divorce was final, the friends of Mr. and Mrs. S. Tilden Daken will regret to hear that they have fallen upon the rocks of their matrimonial sea and been wrecked. I mean, old newspapers are fun.
Yeah.
Here's the Daken girls still looking like twins. In 1922, they went to San Francisco Girls High. Edith May Daken, after my grandmother, and Sydney, my aunt Tilden Daken, after my grandfather. My mother always said we were discovered. These are 1922 painting photographs. They were discovered by the Eastman Kodak Company and did photo shoots in Golden Gate Park. It's kind of fun. That's Eastman Kodak photographer. And on the left is an Eastman Kodak photographer, and on the right, the female photographer had changed her outfit, as did the girls. But they knew not where their father was, because he had gone off to Tahoe to paint, and late in the winter of, late in the fall of 1921, and the storms came early that year, big storms, which I verified in Reno newspapers. And he was stranded for months. And during that time in Lake Tahoe, painted 100 paintings. He exhibited them, and it's the basis for chapter 15 called The Winter of 1922 in the Northern California Alps. He exhibited in Sacramento and Stockton, and I found those catalogs and all 100 paintings. The titles of them are listed in the catalog, which exposed me to the golden age of Tahoe. And I was able to follow his footsteps that winter, and he painted some famous Bay Area people who were wealthy and had big homes in Tahoe. So it was a fun journey. And among those 100 paintings, he had a subgrouping he called My Camps in the Tahoe regions. Paintings 82 through 100, and I'm just going to throw a couple out so you can see how wild he was. Warming my back at Desolation Valley Camp, my camp in the glacier basin where the man in the moon played peekaboo with me. One blanket camp and a cold frosty night, no blanket camp near Gilmore Lake. He was kind of a wild man, I think. And here's some of those paintings, Glacier Basin. I think this is I'm forgetting it at the moment. This is Fallen Leaf Lake. It's one of my favorites. He did, for a short period of time, have a cabin. He calls this My Mountain Den by Moonlight, a winter sketch. This is near Fallen Leaf Lake. Lake of the Woods. This is West Shore. That's Rubicon Peaks, which back then, all those trees were lumber. The lumbermen's demise. Many of Donner Lake, Lake Tahoe, the shores of, this once hung in the Mount Monterey Museum of Art. Many of the Truckee River, this is Sonoma County, Museum of Sonoma County holds this work. And it wasn't just 1922 that he painted in Tahoe. He was there very often. And this is 1910. 1910, went over Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe on a cloudy night, 1910. And that is a Washoe Indian camp there on the shore. Chapter 16 tells about the fact that he was considered and spoken of as the painter of the national parks. Obviously, many of Yosemite. This is Half Dome, Yosemite, But he loved also the Southern Sierra, the national parks, the Inyo and Sequoia and Kings Canyon. And his favorite haunt, the Paiute Pass there, which was Inyo. It transcended over Inyo and Kings Canyon, I think. And here's some of the press he was getting over his Paiute Pass paintings. And here's some of them. Paiute Pass, Paiute Pass. And just when I thought he was a recluse who really just loved to be in the backwoods painting, which obviously he did, he moved to Hollywood right after doing the show from the 1922 Tahoe collection and lived there for about 2.5 years. The Hollywood land sign, which we all know today is the iconic Hollywood sign, this was launched in the year he arrived, 1923, and it was not until the 60s that they took land off that iconic sign. He became, of course, instantly the darling of the social columns and hobnobbed with plenty of stars. And he painted to music, captured sunrise and sunset at the Hollywood Bowl and the Pilgrimage Play Theater, which is today's John Anthony Ford Amphitheater. And he painted to music. Remember, he studied music as a child. This is the Key of Red era that he named it as such, where he was actually painting, unbeknownst to what the music would be, though it would be classical music, and he would paint impromptu in the moods that inspired him from the music, but they were somehow always red. And I learned that he possessed synesthesia. I worked with a professor at Juilliard who studies synesthesia, and she read the 2 Hollywood chapters and said, yes, your grandfather had synesthesia, which is a very rare neurological condition of merging of the senses. Maybe 1 or 2% of us have it, usually musicians and artists. And it's an emotional thing, and many quotes in the book about this, but this one, some musicians do everything but set me on fire. I can feel music in color for hours afterwards from the selections they transferred to me. He's painting there to a pianist. Here's some of those red landscapes. He had many eccentric friends, and especially in Hollywood, Aileen Barnsdall was the daughter of an oil baron, and she is credited with being the first to bring Frank Lloyd Wright to California. He designed for her the Hollyhock House on Olive Hill in Hollywood. And my grandfather was a frequent guest there, painting to music, to musicians that she invited. And how many of you know about Amy Semple McPherson? And if you don't, Google her. She's fascinating. There's been movies written about her. She built in 19 or 20, just before my grandfather moved to Hollywood, she built the Angelus Temple in LA. She was a character. She was married several times. The Angelus Temple is still, it's huge, 5,300 seatings. And her sermons were broadcast nationwide on the radio. And she had many lovers and faked her own suicide, going across the border to Mexico with one of those lovers. My grandfather was very good friends with her publicist, so she bought 2 of my grandfather's paintings and eventually gave them to the publicist because she owed so much. Can you imagine being her publicist? And they remained good friends for years. Here's one of her paintings, Glorious California Sunset, that I kind of like to call Fire and Brimstone. But the publicist, who ended up with the 2 paintings back from Amy Semple McPherson, they are still in the same family, and that family over the years added about 15 more Tilden Daken paintings. And one of the grandsons of the publicist, who just recently died, was a San Franciscan and shared all these stories with me. Again, no shortage of dreams. When he was in Hollywood, he was trying to build an art center also, perhaps influenced by Aileen Barnsdall's art center, which today is still in existence, the Barnsdall Art Center. He had purchased a large piece of land in the Hollywood Hills, designed a painter's palette. It had sunken gardens and 100 studios for artists. And the plans were drawn up in San Francisco, and groundbreaking was to happen in 6 weeks, according to these newspaper articles. He was a dreamer, it never happened. He painted the portraits of some movie stars. This is Virginia Lee Corbin, who died at the ripe old age or young age of 33 after appearing in 50 silent films. And my grandfather is mentioned in the recent biography that was published a couple of years ago. And he would write to my mother, who was in San Francisco in high school, and you'll make it big in Hollywood because you look just like Virginia Lee Corbin, Pearl White, all these movie stars. She pronounced him a dreamer and smartly didn't move to LA. And here's another something that he sent to her. He painted often at Lake Arrowhead, which was, you know, the Hollywood getaway of the era. And they filmed Westerns there, etc. Many Hollywood stars had homes there back in the 20s. And it was called the Rim of the World, the road that wound to Lake Arrowhead. And so he was, you know, he got press. And the press photo he mailed to my mother and wrote on the back, Tilden Daken sketching on the rim of the world like Arrowhead, to Edith. A little arrogant to me, the way he wrote to his daughter, but that was my grandfather, I guess. And this is one of the little paintings that my mother had that I grew up with, that is attributed to Lake Arrowhead. Many press photos of my grandfather. This was taken by Walter Frederick Seeley, who was a noted photographer of movie stars. And on the back, I note on the back in my grandfather's handwriting, it says Tilden Daken, painter and explorer. And someone crossed out painter and explorer and wrote landscape painter. I was tempted to call him an explorer, but didn't want to. And now I learned, not long before I was putting the book to bed, that he considered himself an explorer. And he was, because about the same time he sailed to New Guinea to paint the headhunters. The Chronicle wrote, it's a far cry from the sophisticated follies of Hollywood to the jungles of the untracked islands of the Pacific. Let's hope Daken comes out with the heads of the headhunters and they don't get his instead. Guess who we went to New Guinea with? His buddy that 8 years earlier had brought the show to the 1915 Panama Exposition, the anthropologist who was obviously going to explore the missing link, so-called, it was called Darwin's theory of evolution. And my grandfather was going along for the ride to paint the headhunters. It is the basis for chapter 19. They sailed. I won't tell you how it ends. In 1925, he moved back to Northern California from LA. And he moved to Mill Valley, which this is a 1920s photograph and it still looks exactly the same today. And back then they were saying it's an artist colony with bohemians, hikers in the redwoods. Some things never change. It's the same today. And he lived there for 5 years. And of course, I dove in and found lots of articles about his years. He was still continuing to be very productive and exhibiting and painting to music, etc. There are 2 chapters in the book about his Mill Valley years. But it was the gossip columns that got my attention. My mother was now gone when I learned that he built a home in Mill Valley and had remarried. She had a stepmother that I don't think she ever knew about, and she did not know about the Mill Valley house, and I was born in Marin County. And here it is. I call it the fairy tale house. I immediately went to the Civic Center to look up property records when I read that he had built a home, found the records, immediately drove to the house. Long story, it's all in the book. Hobbits lurk beneath those ferns, right? And this photograph popped up on Wikipedia in 2012 after I'd already discovered the home, and I thought, this is crazy. And the the Wikipedia photographer, the caption was typical of the homes built in the 1920s, surrounded by redwoods in Mill Valley. And that's a lot of homes in Mill Valley. How he came upon my grandfather's house, his myth. And this was the studio that was right next to the house that he built first while he was building the big house. And this, what I call the social media avatar photograph, was taken in that studio in about 1928 in Mill Valley. And of course, he dove in and painted hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Mount Tamalpais paintings. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. They're all in the book and also online. Fall, the fog rolling over Mount Tam, horseback riders in Mill Valley. This is Tamalpais Creek with Tam in the background. This is the cover of my book, Wildfires, Flowers in Spring. Afterglow, this is either Portnoy Creek or Tamalpais Creek. Mount Tam, 1925. 1925. I don't know how many of you know that there was a train back in the day in Marin, and it went to Muir Woods and up the mountain in 281 serpentine turns, the train, and it would push, the engine was in the back, pushing the cars up to the top. And there were inns at the top of the mountain, all the stories in the book. And so guests would take the train up, spend the night, dance, drink the night away, and then take the gravity car back down the mountain. And it was built in the 1890s and met its demise in the Depression. There you see the trains in the distance there. And this is another sort of a time warp painting in Tiburon, Lyford Stone Tower and Archway. He painted it circa 1926, and about a year or two later, the archway was pulled down to make the widen Paradise Drive. So that's a real time warp painting. More Mount Tamalpais. Tamalpais at 6 a.m. He was always up early catching the sunrise. Springtime in Mill Valley. More Mount Tam on the bank of the river, probably Portnoy Creek. Lake Lagunitas on Mount Tam. Another Lake Lagunitas. These are Point Reyes. In July of 29, he dodged a bullet, another fire, the second in his life, the Great Mill Valley Fire. Thousands of acres, 100 homes burned, and downtown and his home, thankfully saved by a shift in the wind. And October 29, we all know what happened, the market crash and the Great Depression, and I discovered that he lost the home in the Depression. It sold to a San Francisco couple who bought it as a second summer home. But I lost track of the next 5 years. I knew he died in 1935, but for a couple of years, the trail went cold until I launched the website in 2012, and two women, then in their late 80s, tracked me down, not knowing of the other. And they had, long story, one was the niece of the woman that he remarried, Florence Daken. They had sketchbooks, oil paintings, photographs, catalogs, but most importantly, it was their stories. And I learned that in 1930, he went cross country with his then wife, my step grandmother, I guess I'd call her, and he exhibited during the Depression in Chicago, Cincinnati, and New York. Here's a couple of the New York paintings, and this must have been a friend, Bill, sketching on the Hudson River. This is Central Park. The Majestic Building was under construction then in the background. And they lived in New York City in Greenwich Village for about 9 months. And I have letterheads from his studio at 22 Charles Street. And he had exhibitions in New York and galleries and department stores. And he hired a New York agent. But the subways and all of that was too much for Tilden to remain long in New York. It's still the Depression. He headed to back to his base of Yosemite and Gold Country in the town of Bootjack, which is in Mariposa County, and set up household tent. That's how they lived for like 9 months. That's Florence on the right. This is a photograph that was taken in Bootjack. That the little girl there who said she had ringworms is a woman who at age 88 and was the niece of Florence Daken, had all of these photographs, and she called this photograph the Motley Crew. That's her father that's shirtless and was an alcoholic. And my grandfather looking sort of very artsy in the background there, and Florence in the dark hair. And here they are in Bootjack, California, dressing up for a dance in town. It was, you know, during the Depression, gold became skyrocketed. And so again, he was trying to get back on his feet and make some money before he moved back to San Francisco. Again, looking sort of quite arrogant as his wife and her sister look behind him. They have wildflowers in their hand. Chapter 24 is the last chapter of a first-person story of his life, and the last chapter is called Endings in Georgetown. I didn't get close enough to God, and I'll tell you in a moment why I titled it that. But Georgetown, this is a 1910 photograph, but Georgetown today looks exactly like this. And he leased a log cabin in the backwoods, and he mined at the Fort Hill mine. Again, trying to get back on his feet. So of all the things I found, on eBay, there were 2 paintings that popped up maybe 8 years ago that came with 5 letters that my grandfather had written. It was the grandson of the New York agent who was selling the paintings and the letters, and one of my close friends bought the paintings so that I could have the letters. It was very sweet. And so I was able to trace his time. He wrote to the New York agent from Bootjack and from Georgetown, and all of his goings on in the gold mine. In early 1935 in Georgetown, still trying to get back to San Francisco, he fell ill and came to San Francisco to be diagnosed, and had the last meeting with my mother. And they're here at the Cliff House with the Seal Rock mural behind them, looking very grim because he was told he had 2 months to live. He had liver cancer, which was because he was painting from the age of 6 with lead paint. And the mining and the shots in Mazatlan, who knows how much lead he had in his body. He went back to Georgetown to die, and died in the cabin. And of course, there were dozens of obituaries. This one's my favorite. Tilden Daken, artist, went back to the mother lode country to die in the land he loved. A painter, Daken abandoned his craft 3 years ago and went into the mountains to mine. As a boy, he had mined with his father in the same locality. With the price of gold soaring, he made a 4-man's mining, and in his log cabin with his mining tools, artist's material, and paintings, he took to his bed and waited the end. Pretty dramatic. Among the possessions that he left behind that were with then his wife Florence, that ended up going to another woman that I met, were the 2 key of red oil studies, which I believe he painted when he knew he was dying. And on the back of one, he wrote his last words. And on the other, I didn't get close enough to God. He's buried, rightly enough, in Georgetown in the Pioneer Cemetery that was founded in 1848 by gold miners. And the 2 last chapters are afterward chapters. The first is titled His Last Palette, because I discovered that his palette, which I believe his headstone, I believe he designed himself knowing he was dying. And it used to have 4 paintbrushes, but it's the journey, it's the story of the journey of 4 people that visited his grave. In 1983, it was a Daken collector who I discovered through eBay in 1999, who gave me all these stories that he had learned about my grandfather in Georgetown. 1999, when I first learned where he was buried, I journeyed there. I returned in 2017, And 1940, a photographer, a noted photographer of the era, found his tombstone and photographed it. And I found the photograph and purchased it at a gallery in Los Angeles. And there I am in 2017. As you see, over the years, the palette lost all of its paintbrushes and turned a verdigris bronze green. And afterward, 2 is titled Finding Tilden. In 2017, I went on a search there. I had come across the cabin in which he died, and that's Florence, not long after he died. I went on a search with 3 forest rangers who agreed to accompany me to search for the cabin and the Fort Hill mine. And there we are. We discovered the Fort Hill mine, but not the cabin, but I know what happened to it. It's in the book, and the story ends with a very kismet story in the Miners Club, which was a bar, is still today a bar that is in Georgetown. It was built during the Civil War, and it's a crazy sort of ending. That was another kismet story. And that's it. That's my grandfather's story. You can learn more about him on the website, tildendaken.com. The book is available through the Nevada Museum of Art, and anyone who's interested out there in Zoom land, you can go to the website, the book page of the website, and there's a direct link to the book. And there's a wonderful article on Wikipedia about him that was written by an art historian in Washington, D.C. So there's plenty out there to learn more about my grandfather. And I thank you again for all coming this evening. I never looked at my watch, and I know I ran over.
We're a little over time.
Yeah, I knew
We don't
that
have
was gonna
time for
happen.
questions.
Okay.
Because we want to make sure if someone wants to get the book, that they can get it from you. You have
Okay.
the book here, and you
I
sign it for
do, I
folks.
do.
It's in the back.
I'm sorry, I apologize to everyone. I am typically, I run over. There's a lot of stories. Thank you.
It was great. I
Thank
mean,
you.
I think it's not a lot of questions on Zoom, but I will
Okay.
give you those questions.
All
and
right.
make Work to answer them. for
Perfect,
folks.
thank you.
And if you're
Thank
here
you,
and you have a
Kevin.
question, you can follow Bonnie to the back and ask your question while others maybe peruse the book and acquire the book for their collections. So thanks everyone
Thank
for
you
coming.
again to everyone for.
I can kind of jump on here and just say goodbye. First of all, let's give a big round of applause to our speaker, Bonnie Portnoy. You can register for all book club programs online at bccbooks.org. You can also click the link in any of the emails that you're getting from the book club. Or you can contact me. I'm Kevin at bccbooks.org, and I'll sign you up for any program you're interested in. Thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you soon.